Well, good afternoon if you are in Memphis, Tennessee, or Rochester, New York, or Atlanta, Georgia, or here in New York City, where I'm broadcasting from, or anywhere in the Americas. Good evening if you are in Salzburg, if you are in Milan, if you are in Helsinki. Greetings to people in South Africa, greetings to people all over the world where music is made and music is loved. Welcome to Fred Plotkin on Fridays on Adagio, the place where classical music happens. As you know, Adagio is a video and audio streaming platform dedicated to supporting artists and to making classical music and opera available to fans all around the world. My guest today, I want to say up front, is a good friend. So we're going to be speaking as friends speak. He's someone I've wanted to have on this program for a long time. His name is Courtney Carey, and he's joining me from his home in New York City, but we're going to talk about a lot of places today. Courtney, I was thinking about how can I best describe you. I'm the Renaissance man, so we have to give you something else. But what I was thinking was, and I mean this seriously, thinking in musical terms, if we were to take a beautiful stone and throw it in a lake, and then the vibrations that come from where the stone landed, and the impact and the consequence and the way you reach and touch all kinds of things effectively and beautifully is, I think, the beginning of the way I would describe you as a man and as a musician. Because I think if I have to label this conversation, it's my friend Courtney Carey, musician. Does that work?
That works for me.
All right. You, if I'm correct, you were born in Memphis, Tennessee. Is that true?
Yes, indeed.
So I've always had a fascination about the state of Tennessee. For
Okay.
people who are listening around the world, you may not know that Tennessee is a horizontal state in the
Hmm.
United States, in the south, but in southeast, but also toward the Midwest, toward the Mississippi River on one end. And there are not that many horizontal states in America.
Hmm.
There are square states, there are a couple of round states and vertical states and stupid states, but
Tell the truth and shame the devil.
but Tennessee and Kentucky, I think of, and North Carolina as, and Virginia in its way, vertical states. New York is a thing unto itself because it goes north and south, but also points west. Florida is sinking, and it's a thing unto
Ah.
itself. Yeah. But a lot of states, Louisiana, Arkansas, are squarer in their ways.
Mhm.
Illinois is vertical. Wisconsin, Minnesota are vertical. There are the Dakotas, the plain states are more horizontal, but there's no one there in those places. But
Mhm.
Tennessee has a high population, and
Yeah, yeah.
Tennessee has um, the Mississippi River on one end. It has beautiful mountains, what's called Appalachia. It has a central of state is sort of lush, beautiful valleys and more gentle mountains.
Mhm.
And when I have to name the states in America that have disproportionately contributed to our music, I name New York, I name
Mhm.
Louisiana, I name Tennessee,
Mhm.
and then I can name others. I can name Michigan, Texas, California, a few others, but I would rank Tennessee in the top three. Would you?
Yeah, I would actually.
Yeah.
I mean, I won't be biased and say number one, but
No, it's not
but no,
number one.
definitely, but definitely top three.
But it's very particular for that.
Mhm.
The eastern part of the state is Knoxville, is I guess the most famous city, Chattanooga, Knoxville,
Mhm.
and there it's sort of, would we call it bluegrass? Would we call it country? Not really traditional country music, but Dolly Parton is from that part of the state.
Yeah.
How would we define the music of Eastern Tennessee?
It's so funny because we just sort of say country. It's the first thing that comes to mind. We don't. It's so odd. We don't put like classifications and labels on it other than sort of the broad one. But if I had to think about it, I mean, I'd say a little bit bluegrass, um, and more. Let's see. Who? Let me think about some people. So Dolly Parton. I'm thinking. I mean, he's not from Tennessee, but yeah, I'd definitely just say country. I
Hmm.
don't know that I can put a more finite label on it than that.
But I think of it too as the place where, because it's Appalachia, that poor white people, many of them are descended from Scotland and Ireland,
Mm-hmm.
brought their vocal traditions, their Celtic traditions,
Mm-hmm.
encountered African Americans and their musical traditions, which of course are throughout the state of Tennessee and many other states. But where they blend is
Mm-hmm.
how I find the music to be different. So the center of the state is Nashville, and
Yeah.
Nashville is known as Music City. I had not gotten there in my working life until about 5 years ago,
Oh
and
wow.
was completely blown away by the love of music in Nashville.
Did you
Um,
have barbecue?
I had barbecue. I also had hot chicken.
There you
Um,
go. Come on here.
with, and I mean this, the best black eyed peas salad I've ever had. I've never had black eyed peas salad. And it
Mhm.
was with a mild vinegar and a little bit of green onion. It was
Yep.
spectacular. That
Try
was
next time. Try the black eyed pea soup with
all
cornbread
right.
crouton. Yes, sir.
Okay. We're gonna get into food later, Courtney. Um, but the thing is, my friend Dean Williamson is the conductor at the Nashville Opera. There's a symphony.
Mhm.
Plus, it's the home of so-called country or country and Western music, but
Yeah.
so much more. I mean, it's music industry in a way,
Mhm. Mhm.
and it's. I went to the Ryman Auditorium. I was there for a wedding actually, but spent a few more days because I really wanted to explore the area and discover the musical scene. And I got a chance to lecture at Vanderbilt University. I really immersed in Nashville for a few days,
Mhm.
and I was astonished, not because I had any other expectation, but the reverence for music is so deep, and
Mhm.
the quality of the musicians I encountered everywhere was so high
Mhm.
that um, it speaks remarkably for Tennessee. And we haven't
Yeah.
even
Yeah.
gotten to Memphis yet, which is remarkable too.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
have you worked at all in Nashville?
I have. I did some. I mean, it's been a long time ago. A couple of recitals at Vanderbilt, as a matter of fact. So a friend of mine from Morehouse was. I think he worked. He finished his doctorate there, and he started working on the faculty. And he invited my best friend in the whole world, Martin Woods, and I to come there and do a recital. We sort of done this recital before in college, and he loved it and said, "Could you come and sing?" And I was like, yeah, of course. And so we went and we did a recital there. It was a part of it was the every year they have like the MLK
Martin
celebrations and
Luther
what
King. Yep.
yeah, Martin Luther King celebrations. And so he invited us to come and sing for one of those. And then I did. I want to say it was a gospel music. Yeah, it was a gospel music workshop. This maybe a few years after that,
Hmm.
another Morehouse classmate of mine
Yep.
worked at a very large and prominent church in Nashville and asked us to come also and do some work with his choir, and we did that
Hmm.
as well.
And then we move, and I'm skipping small towns, and we're moving to the big cities, Memphis, where I have only changed planes, but I've never. I was working in Little Rock, Arkansas, and changed planes. I've never been to Memphis yet,
You
and
just broke my heart. Are you serious?
I am serious. But
Whoa!
I've never been to Cape Cod either, so there are places I've not gotten to,
Wow!
or Martha's Vineyard, or that part of New England I've never been to. So, um, but the point is, when I go to a place, I like to go and stay,
Yeah.
and I like to really dig in. And just to mention, probably the most famous person is Elvis Presley,
Mm-hmm.
but um, Isaac Hayes,
Mm-hmm.
Mignon Dunn, the great mezzo
Yes,
soprano.
indeed. I
Um,
was going to say that. Yeah.
there is,
Actress Kathy Bates.
who was the last one?
Kathy Bates.
Kathy Bates, of course.
Yeah.
And is Justin Timberlake and Reese Witherspoon, are
Yep.
they from? Yeah,
Uh-huh.
okay. So a lot of talent there. Courtney Carey. Um,
Hey.
now Aretha Franklin, was she born in Memphis?
That I
I know
don't
she's
know.
born in Tennessee. We
I
think of
don't.
her as Detroit, but she was born in
That I was.
Tennessee.
Yeah, I
Tina
don't know.
Turner. Where is
Yes,
Nutbush?
Nutbush. Yep.
Yeah, so Tina Turner in Memphis.
Yeah.
So, but Memphis, when I think of Memphis, I think of the so-called soul music as
Hmm.
being the city where that's from. Stax
Yeah.
Records, STAX
Yeah.
Records,
Yep.
and talk about soul music as compared to country music. Um, Soul music is much more influenced by African American traditions
Hmm. Hmm.
directly, rather than a blend like in Knoxville. Um,
Yeah.
what makes soul music soul music?
Ooh. This is gonna sound silly, but it literally is the in the title, the soul. It's like, you bring out all of your energy and your heart and all that stuff into the music. And um, it's funny you mentioned the word soul though, because like, I mean, this is just maybe a thing of like how I grew up. So a lot of the music I listened to was not soul music. We looked at soul as like the late 60s and the 70s.
Hmm.
What I was listening to, what and sort of as in my my childhood, was the blues.
Yeah,
That's really what, and that's why I think I got so interested in spirituals, because somehow those bent notes in the blues just sort of, it just blended into church and then blended into the spirituals and whatnot. But I would say if there was like a real legit soul singer who I knew was from Memphis, it would be Isaac Hayes.
yeah.
Isaac Hayes went to, I want to say it was Manassas High School, and he went to school with some of my second cousins,
Hmm.
Mary, so forth and so on. And he was like, a god. You know what I'm saying? I
Yeah.
mean, he was like, hometown hero. But I didn't listen to so much soul music. But as I have matured, I can go back and look at it and say, what they were doing was, I mean, to be honest with you, it was really church music. So much of it, it's what they
Hmm.
learned in church. When you mentioned Aretha Franklin, that was the first thing that I thought of. I was like, oh, well,
Yeah.
church lady, yeah.
Well, Aretha, her not her husband, her father was Reverend C.K. Franklin, one of the most
Mm.
famous preachers, and they would tour. And Aretha, as a little girl, she had two sisters, but she was the singer they wanted to hear. And he would give these spellbinding sermons that
Mhm.
were often recorded and sold on records, and then
Yeah.
Aretha would sing. And
Uh-huh.
although Detroit was the base, um, they spent a lot of time in Tennessee and other parts of the South, but especially Tennessee, at a time, God help us, but racism was still prevalent, unfortunately, in the extreme. But it was just more out there.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I mean, racism, sadly, it's like a horrible virus and it's still here, but there are some laws that try to mitigate against it. But
Yeah.
in the 40s and 50s and early 60s, when Sam Cooke, when Aretha Franklin were
Mhm.
touring the South in churches, and not just them, but those specifically, um, they had to travel with great difficulty.
Mhm.
It was very unsafe, and they had to go to something called the Green Book, that was a guide where African Americans traveling in the South knew that it was a safe hotel or a safe restaurant where they
Mhm.
could appear. And that came up in that tradition. Since you mentioned the blues, Tennessee is right north of Memphis. Tennessee is north of Mississippi and the Delta. So you
Mhm.
had Robert Johnson, you
Mhm.
had B.B. King, you had Elvis Presley, who was from Tupelo, Mississippi. Um, you had that whole remarkable tradition coming up from that part of the deep, deep South.
Mhm.
Um, and so Memphis, in my view, and as I said, I've only changed planes there, is the confluence of the South, the Midwest, the North, musically, in a way that Nashville is not.
Mhm. Mhm.
Nashville is unmistakably Nashville. It's Music
Yeah.
City. It's all that. It's the museums. I really loved it when I was there. Knoxville is smaller. It's more countrified. But
Mhm.
Memphis is the place where the rivers flow, so to speak. The musical rivers flow. the Courtney Carey Stone that I spoke about before. It spreads. And is it Beale Street? Is the famous music
Yeah,
street? Yeah, yeah.
yeah,
Were you
yeah.
allowed as a boy to go to Beale Street?
Oh yeah. This funny
Okay.
thing, Bill Street was only a 5-minute drive from my house. We lived practically downtown. We lived on the main thoroughfare that leads you to Bill Street. So I'd go to Bill Street. I mean, not, in the bars and stuff, of course, but could you imagine? But no, I would go to Bill Street. And then we would also go to every year Mud Island, which is also downtown, and we'd go to music festivals down there as a part of like the summer sessions that they had on Mud Island. And a lot of the blues musicians would come to Mud Island and they would play for the students, so we could sort of get those sounds into our ears and whatnot.
So I love the verb I'm about to use. It's not mine. Ian McKellen used it.
Uh-huh.
When were you alerted to your musicality?
Oh wow, I don't know that
how?
there was
I like that word, alerted.
Yeah. Um. Hmm. Boy, that you kind of stumped me with that one. That's a good one. Um. I don't know. I mean, I can't remember a time where like music wasn't a part of my life, my daily life. I was raised by my grandmother and my great aunt in Memphis, and they were very old school. And I mean, I have as a sort of an early memory. I was about 4. My aunt worked as a housekeeper for something like 50 something years for one family, and every morning at like 4 o'clock, she'd get up like clockwork. 4 o'clock in the morning, turn the radio on was the first thing she did. WDIA in Memphis, Tennessee. And then my grandmother would get up right behind her and go downstairs and start getting ready for the day. And there's a song, and this is not a classical music song, but it's a song called "Reasons" by Earth, Wind, and Fire.
Uh-huh.
And that was my aunt's favorite song. She just passed away last year. She was 95, and that was her favorite song. And my earliest memory of music is that song. And for her 90th birthday, we asked her to sing instead of "Happy Birthday." We sang, as a family, we sang "Reasons" for her birthday song. So I mean, I guess I knew what music was then, and I knew that it was something that we were supposed to enjoy, that it brought a lot of joy and happiness to our house. Beyond that, I can't really think of a moment where I just sort of said, I'm gonna be a musician, or I am a musician. I don't know that thought has ever crossed my mind, because I've just always been in the fabric of music since I was a little kid.
But when you were a small boy and your voice had not yet broken and become the gorgeous baritone that it is, you sang. Were you a treble? Were you an alto? What were you as a pre-pubescent singer?
I was always a baritone. No, just I was a really high
singing "Do My Holder Abendstern."
Come on. Exactly. in my good what is it that Leontine Price said? My Southern German. Yeah.
I once heard her refer to some. She was singing in Mississippi Latin.
I can hear her saying that too. With some fabulous fur coat on, just like while she's saying.
Right. Libera me.
Right. Full of good songs. Full of them. But I was a boy. I was a soprano for a while.
Yeah.
And I don't know if you remember this. So this is far later, but in the 90s, Mariah Carey came onto the scene, and my grandmother, God bless her, never screamed at me. She never, sort of thrashed me for singing to the top of my lungs. I would sing whatever Mariah Carey's like whistle notes were.
Right.
Perfect ease, like easy breezy. And I still now, like if I really vocalize well, I can still make a high E flat like above the high C in soprano land.
Yeah.
I don't do that too often these days, but I can still sort of climb up there if I need to.
So you can sing Falstaff.
Yeah, 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 indeed.
I know every note. uh, so you you know, in my family, we had a saying that we always quoted. My dad was a musician. There are only two kinds of music, good music and the other kind. And that was
Mhm,
said by Duke Ellington.
mhm, mhm,
So I grew up in a household where we had all kinds of music here. And I guess in my case, maybe in your case, the radio brought a lot of it in. My father brought
mhm,
it in because he was a musician, so he played it. But we had WQXR here in New York. This was before streaming, before Adagio, and we heard what was on the radio. And here at that time, WQXR, which was born in 1935, had an AM and an FM side. The
mhm.
FM was for music, the AM was for talk, but it was
Talk. Yep.
talk about music. And we had hosts such as Robert Sherman, Lloyd Moss, George Jelinek, these people who would have on the great musicians coming in with their European accents and talking about, well, I knew Richard Strauss, and Richard Strauss said to me that you should not hold that note, you should not sing that role. And I heard this stuff and I loved it
Mhm,
because, you know, Carl Haas was another one who every day would take apart a movement of a Beethoven sonata or one song by Schubert. And this was musicology. These were lessons that were available to anyone who wanted to learn. And it was
mhm.
completely democratic. It was just there for the taking. And then
Yep.
we switched to the FM side, and you could hear Leontine Price singing, or Yasha Heifetz playing, or
Mhm.
George Schulte conducting, or Leonard Bernstein giving a master class with music. And so, we grew up this was not specialized. It was not for fancy kids with a lot of money. It was for anyone. And my image of Tennessee is a bit that maybe there was not, the radio station where they were teaching the music, so to speak, but there were enough venues for you to go learn the music that any young boy or girl could go and find it if you wanted it.
Mhm. You are exactly right. You are exactly right, and exactly what you said about FM and AM. That's exactly how it was.
Hmm.
I mean, I have a few more gray hairs than I would like to admit, but I'm old enough to have experienced the AM FM where the AM was the talk, or it was later on it was only classical music on two of our prominent channels in Memphis, and then in the afternoons they would pick up more of the pop and the R&B
Hmm.
stuff. And the FM played R&B and blues and whatnot the entire day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So on Sundays in New York, starting Saturday night, but then all day Sunday, um, because as I said, my dad loved all kinds of music, almost all kinds of music. Um, we had W, what was it? HCR, Harlem Community Radio was
Huh.
one of them, WHCR. And there was another station that went to all the black churches. And, we would have an hour of worship from the Garden of Prayer in Brooklyn, which was my favorite, the Garden of
Oh
Prayer.
wow.
I don't know if you've ever been there, but
No,
I just
no.
loved the choir in the garden. It sounded so great anyway, the Garden of Prayer.
Yeah.
And then to Harlem, and then to Queens, and then to Mount Vernon. And each church tried to outdo the church on the hour before for how they sang and what they sang. And it's where I first encountered the concept of the mass choir in the
Choir.
black church. Would you talk about what is a mass choir in the black church?
Yeah. So the mass choir, at least, I'm going to put it a little bit differently in the sense that I'll talk about my home church, Pleasant View Missionary Baptist Church in Memphis. So we had basically three choirs. You had the sanctuary choir, which was equivalent to like the professional choir. It was the people who could really sing. You had the gospel choir that sang more like the traditional gospel music, sort of like the, I mean, if you want to think of it this way, like the Mahalia Jackson type gospel
Mm-hmm.
songs, or the, Clara Ward singers. And then you had the mass choir. The mass choir was a combination of all of the choirs in the church that
Ah.
everybody came together and sang. Um, and I mean, you think about some of the most prominent mass choirs. They're, I mean, people may get mad at people saying this, but they're all from the South, like the Georgia Mass Choir, the
Yeah.
Mississippi Mass Choir.
Mississippi
You know,
is my favorite.
yeah, oh yeah, 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 yeah. Um, so
Sorry,
yeah,
Georgia, but Mississippi is my favorite.
and so many of those songs that they would sing, like we would sing at church. I mean, the albums would come out like in those days. You get, like a cassette, and the
Yep.
single would come out, and then the next week we were singing that song at church.
Yeah.
So yeah, the Mississippi Mass Choir was numero uno in my book.
I think so too. But here in New York, I don't know what Memphis was like, but in New York, obviously, the congregations of different denominations of Black churches were primarily frequented by Black people, but not only.
Mm-hmm,
And
mm-hmm.
we had all kinds of New Yorkers going to the services before the European tourists, before the French and the Germans would come to go to Abyssinian Baptist Church and sit there like tourists. But
Mm-hmm.
we New Yorkers would go there, and I had a little girlfriend at the time, Ramona, and I went to her church on Sundays in Harlem. And the sense, I'm going to use very old terms, but you'll know what I mean. Listeners will know what I mean. Community and fellowship that was so genuine,
Mm-hmm.
was so imbued with love. And even if you were not a regular member of the congregation. And
Mm-hmm.
I went with Ramona for a number of years there. And then there was a lovely lady named Rosalie who looked after me while my mom was at work. And Rosalie was from the Gullah part of South Carolina and Georgia.
Oh,
And her speech, her language vocabulary was entirely different from
mm-hmm.
typical American speech. Her
Did
pronouns,
she ever sing? Did
huh?
she ever sing? Did she ever sing for you?
She sang constantly for me. And
Isn't it? It's one of the most interesting vocalisms. I mean, it's
yeah,
so. It's anyway. Sorry to interrupt you, but
she
I
had a
wondered.
very deep voice.
Yeah, and I was just about to
She,
say, yeah.
she was like Mavis Staples. You
Mm-hmm,
know,
mm-hmm,
for people who don't know, Mavis Staples is one of the greatest gospel singers and civil rights singers and remarkable people, and Bob Dylan's lover, apart from anything
mm-hmm,
else. But
mm-hmm.
fabulous, fabulous singer who's still with us. And I don't know if you've ever heard Mavis Staples warm up, but she does it this way. And I'm not a singer. Yes. No.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. No. And she will go lower on the yes and higher on the no until she has enough notes. And then she'll say, okay, baby, I'm ready to sing.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
Rosalie, who was not a professional singer, sang that way. And she would go deep, deep, deep,
Lots of chest voice. Yeah, yeah,
lots of chest voice.
yeah.
And, and not just on Sundays when she would be looking after me on a Thursday afternoon. Um, she looked like Ella Fitzgerald. She didn't know who Ella Fitzgerald was, but she looked like Ella Fitzgerald. And she sang songs that were a combination of traditional gospel, but
Mm-hmm.
also African based
Yep.
in
You are.
languages that I didn't know, that because her English was really not very good. It
Yeah.
was not about education. It was just where she grew up in a place that was not speaking conventional Southern American English.
English. Yep. Yep.
But
It's funny you mentioned. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just to say her connection to the words. She couldn't read, but she knew the words, and her connection to what she was saying was as good as a leader singer.
Oh wow.
In part because she just didn't know what she was doing. She was doing what she felt
Yeah.
with no attempt to be a musician.
Yeah.
And that was very influential on me because from Rosalie, of all people, I learned the connection to lyrics.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it was just phenomenal. And they were 98% about Jesus. But
Yeah.
within that context, she never just sang the words because she learned them as a girl. She sang them as if for the first time every time.
Yeah.
It was stunning.
Yeah. I asked you if she ever sang for you, because the first time I ever heard anyone from sort of the Gullah community was when I moved here. I
Hmm.
worked at an AME church, and I remember asking the pastor, why did they clap a certain way? It was a
Yeah.
some rhythm like that. And he explained to me where this came from in the community, and that there were like 4 or 5 ladies at the church who were from, excuse me, from the Carolinas. One was from two were from South Carolina, I think it was. And I was about to, I remember her name now. I can see her just as clear as day. And they all had such deep voices,
Yeah.
and they never, like, if you ask them to sort of go into head voice, couldn't do it. No matter how good the voice instruction was, could never get into head voice. Everything was in pretty much my range, and
Yeah.
sometimes even lower. So I was very curious when you mentioned that, if she'd ever sung for you.
Another particular thing about her, and I don't know whether others were that way too, she could not pronounce th, but I don't think
Mm-hmm,
it was dental. I think it was just that this is how she learned.
mm-hmm,
So she was not from South Carolina. She was
mm-hmm,
from South Carolina,
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
and you'd be, not with, you'd be with.
Mm-hmm,
So it's
mm-hmm.
not a whiff. Some people say put an F where the TH is. She had
Yeah.
sort of a long double sibilant S.
Mm-hmm.
South Carolina. Um, both of you, not both of
Uh-huh.
you. Yeah.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
But anyway, I'm bringing all this up because um, you come, I think, initially, but just initially from that tradition. But
Mm-hmm.
in my experience of you, you have gone in so many wonderful musical directions that, to quote Jesse Norman, who had a deep voice sometimes, pigeonholes are for pigeons.
Amen, Jesse.
And therefore, far be it from me to define you.
Mm-hmm.
But I want to talk about I'm trying to think where to start with you because there's so much. You began as a baritone.
Mm-hmm.
You are a baritone. You studied at Morehouse College, which you mentioned. I don't think
Mm-hmm.
all my listeners know what Morehouse College is and what it represents in
Mm-hmm.
music and in civil rights and in everything. What
Yeah.
is Morehouse College?
Morehouse College is the nation's only all-male African American institution.
For
it is,
university,
yeah, yeah,
academic. Yeah.
academic, college. And some of the most prominent figures in world history passed through Morehouse. Obviously, Martin Luther King Jr. Is one. Samuel L. Jackson, terrific actor. Spike Lee, Maynard Jackson.
Director. Yeah.
Yeah, the list goes on and on and on. Um, and so, yeah, I went to Morehouse for my undergraduate studies. So I went there for 4 years. And I don't know if it's still the same way, but at the time, you didn't get a bachelor's of music degree. You got a bachelor of arts, and you had to specialize in some particular, medium, whether it was composition or whatever. And I did music, which would allow me to sort of study everything. And then my concentration later on was voice.
Hmm. And it's
Yeah.
in Atlanta.
Yes. It's
Yeah.
in Atlanta, Georgia. Yep.
So Atlanta has gone through so many phases as a city.
Mm-hmm.
Because it was, people know the film or the book Gone with the Wind. It was that part of the
Mm-hmm.
South, but it has also used the nickname "the city too busy to hate." It tries to
Mm-hmm.
establish itself as a great business center. For many years, I always felt that Atlanta was somewhat lacking in terms of opera, but now it has one of the great opera companies in America, headed by Tomer Zulin. It's really, really blossoming and booming, and is a leading opera company in the United States and not just another opera company. The Atlanta Symphony has always been great. The chorus of the Atlanta Symphony, which was headed by many years by Robert Shaw,
Robert Shaw.
maybe the best. I don't want to say the best, but certainly Margaret Hillis in Chicago, Robert Shaw in Atlanta. There are a few
Hmm.
that really were just always outstanding of being belonging to the symphony, and therefore the great choral programs that one
Hmm.
finds in the symphony hall were always done more in Atlanta and Chicago than a lot of other places.
Hmm.
Um, and when you were in Atlanta, talk about how you were exposed to that world of music and how you grew as a student and as a musician in your college years.
It's so funny you just mentioned Robert Shaw's name. My face lit up because I was very, very lucky. My freshman year at Morehouse was Robert Shaw's last year as
Uh,
the director of the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra and Chorus. And he passed away that winter. And we sang for his memorial service in the 1999. Um, and I'll never forget that experience. So Marietta Simpson was one of his favorite mezzo sopranos, and
mhm.
they flew her in to sing a song which I didn't know as a spiritual. They say it's a spiritual. I feel like it might be spiritual influenced, but it's a song called "Sometimes I Feel Like a Moaning Dove,"
Yeah.
and you could hear a pin drop. Like, I mean, no exaggeration. It was, I mean, even just thinking about it now, what do you call it, the little goosebump thing, whatever.
Yep.
It was such a dynamic experience. And right before he passed away, we did the Christmas concerts, and he conducted half of the concert, and then the Glee Club sang, the Morehouse Glee Club sang, the Spelman Glee Club sang, and then we did some stuff all together. And I remember, I don't know if you can see, but I remember the thing about him, and we were warned about this, was that he would conduct with the elbows. You have to watch the
Ah,
elbows, not so much the
mhm.
hand. Watch those elbows. And sure enough, every beat where we were supposed to come in was in the elbows, but it was some of the most focused, tight movement that I'd seen. And I think you asked me sort of about my time there. If there's something that I remember, it's how he spoke to us. He didn't speak to us like we were college kids just learning about music. He spoke to us like we were equals. Like
Mhm.
everything, all of his musical language was like we were peers. We were, colleagues on the same footing. And I mean, it just made all of the difference in the world. It elevated us in a way, you know. Um,
Mhm.
the one thing I sort of jump off to something else because it sort of dovetails off of the Robert Shaw experience. After we sang the Christmas concert my first year, a lot of my classmates went to get church jobs, becoming staff singers and whatnot. I'd never heard of that. So talking about just sort of my home church earlier, in Memphis, we didn't at the time when I was growing up, we didn't have staff singers. Whoever was in the churches who sang. We didn't
Mhm.
pull in people from outside. And so when my friends, this was the second semester of my freshman year, my friends started going off getting church jobs. I was like, well, what is that? They pay you to go sing somewhere.
Mhm.
I just wasn't thinking that way. And all of those experiences were so helpful just to sort of see the process and understand what my colleagues were doing. Because you have to understand, I wasn't a music major at first. I was a political science major for a while. And I'd even gotten what call it an internship with the Democratic Party of Georgia. I was the work study student for the chair of the Department of Political Science. So, I mean, I was on a completely different path. And so all of this, stuff with Robert Shaw and like, my friends going off to audition for these gigs and whatnot, that was all new to me. I didn't
Mhm.
know anything about any of that. And
Um,
so that was
yeah.
sort of Morehouse experience.
And I know, and other people know about you, that you are not only a singer, wonderful though that is, you are a conductor.
Mm-hmm.
You are a noted conductor, and there have been some singers, not that many, who have then gone on to conducting careers. I'm thinking
Mm-hmm.
of Natalie Stutzmann, the French contralto who now heads the Atlantic Symphony.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and there are a few. Barbara Hannigan, soprano,
Mm-hmm.
Canadian soprano, is also conducting. And it's not unheard of, but it is a choice.
Mm-hmm.
And my first question for you, let's think in terms of conducting vocal music that also has instruments as well. In what part of your musical brain is this happening? So that is it the singer who approaches the musical score and brings out the vocal line? Is it the musician who can read the orchestral line and finds the message there? I hate that word, but you know what I mean, the message in the music right there. What's going on in your head as you conduct something choral and vocal?
I don't know that this is going to be necessarily a satisfactory answer, but I don't think about any of that. For me, it's about the energy. And I think maybe it sort of goes hand in hand with it. But when I'm conducting, especially if it's choir, if it's something with just choir and perhaps piano, that's a little bit different for me than something with choir and orchestra. I've noticed, especially recently, that when I'm working with an orchestra, the way I move is different, because I noticed that orchestras can sometimes misinterpret the gesture as getting faster. And when you're with a choir, you have to reach all the way across the room or back, to the back of the choir loft or whatever, to get them to you, to see what's happening. And so a lot of times when I'm conducting choir, I'm thinking about the energy that I want from them. And, obviously when, any conductor's job is sort of corralling the energy of any group that they have, because everybody's going to have an interpretation. Everybody's going to have a way that they want to, perhaps want to sing it. There are very few times that I've stood in front of a group and thought about, as I'm conducting, what they need to do vocally. I think, and that's not to say that I haven't gone through all of that with them in rehearsals and whatnot, but it's just when I'm doing what I'm doing, it's an energy thing. It's, if you've ever seen me, I carry on a little bit. But with orchestra, it's different. And I will say, when I'm with an orchestra, I am thinking more about singing, especially if it's like, for example, we did Opera in the Park back here in June, and even in rehearsals, I remember specifically saying to the violins, even if you don't want to do it, sing this line as you're playing it, and it'll improve it. And I won't have to ever say anything else about this particular phrase. Mm-hmm. They did it. And it was a lot. It was Barbara Quintiliani was singing, what is it? Costa Diva. Mm-hmm. And they have the be-da-da-dee-da-da-be-da. And I was like, okay, this can, sort of sound like accordion music, we're not careful, And they sang that line, and it changed it. But I don't know that I go into it thinking specifically as a singer or as a conductor or whatever. I guess I'm thinking more about the energy I'm wanting to pull out from everybody, if that makes sense. It
does. In rehearsal, let's pick a piece. Let's pick a so-called classical piece that you might conduct that's choral. You name it.
Hallelujah from Mount of Olives, Beethoven.
Okay. How do you start the rehearsal? Do you start with the singers in the chorus? Do you start with the instrumental musicians? How does that work?
For me, we always start with the choir. We always start with the chorus. And I play for myself 99% of the time. I hate to say it because we were talking about Atlanta, and, Robert Shaw had a wonderful assistant, Norman McKenzie, when I was a student there. And I don't know that Norman would have ever received or achieved his brilliance as a choral conductor had he not had the experience with Robert Shaw. But for me, it's just, I can get more done if I'm at the piano doing it myself. So I play for myself for almost all of my rehearsals until like maybe toward the end, if we're doing like a big work, then I'll have an accompanist come in. And certainly for church services, the musicians, the band will come in and play, rehearsal at the end of the rehearsal, just so we sort of know what we're doing here. But yeah, and then I would say I go into the orchestra rehearsals with the information that I've sort of shared with the singers in terms of my interpretation, and certain things that I know we're going to need as an
Hmm.
ensemble for the choir or for the soloists who happen to be singing. Um, I don't know that this is the right thing to say, but I've almost never spoken to an orchestra in orchestral speak. I've
Okay.
always spoken to orchestras in singer speak and in standard musical terminology. I remember, and this is not an indictment on the musicians. This is just we just speak different language. I remember year before last we were doing Messiah, and I asked the strings to play legato in a particular passage, and the one of the violists stopped me and she said, What do you mean? You mean slur it?" And I was like, "Okay, well, if that's what you
Hmm.
want to call it, slur it.
Hmm.
Smooth, whatever. Essentially the same thing, different way of saying it. As far as I'm concerned. Um, so then we put the whole thing together. There are some times where I find that if I have worked on the music with, there's only one time that this has happened. I should say it this way. We did the Vivaldi Gloria, and there's another piece. Oh God, what is it? It's a motet. One of the sopranos did the Alleluia from, is it In Justissime, In Furore Justissime, or something or other like that. I can't remember the proper name right now. And I worked with the orchestra first. Big mistake.
Hmm.
Big mistake. And it was just a thing of the timing. We couldn't work it out any other way because a lot of the singers were doing another gig at the time. And it just, the performances were great and they're even on Adagio, but I think if I'd done it the reverse, I think that certain things would have gelled better. I think that the performance would have been a little bit more musical because the orchestra would have had the singers more in mind than just their fiddles and harpsichord.
Hmm. Now, when you are conducting, there are many, many conductors who conduct musical performances with or without singers,
Mhm.
where they're at a keyboard of one kind or another. Um, Often because someone like Mitsuko Uchida, who is a wonderful pianist, or Murray Pariah may lead the instrumentalist from the keyboard. Leifova
Mhm.
Ansnes does it. A few of them are doing this more among the pianists. Um, I divide those people into two groups: those who are superb instrumental soloists who are also leading a group of musicians, and superb conductors who can also play on the keyboard.
Mhm.
And the sound is completely different. Not better or worse, but
Mhm.
within 90 seconds, I kind of know which one I'm hearing today. Daniel Barenboim is a famous example of that,
Mhm.
where he will be the pianist conducting, and he's a superb conductor, and he's a superb pianist. But sometimes I don't know which one has arrived. Sometimes it is the pianist, and sometimes it is the conductor. Um, but somehow, at least to me, never both.
Mhm.
I'm going to make a distinction here that in the Black church, the person at the piano, whether he or she is leading the musicians or not, has a lot more of a voice with the fingers. So
Mhm. Mhm.
I will
Mhm.
name three. The most famous for me is Aretha Franklin, who
Mhm.
could sing one thing, play
Mhm.
something entirely, and not just church music. I heard her at Radio City Music Hall in New York a number of years ago, and it was Easter time. And she sang a lot of Aretha music, but then she decided to do Irving Berlin,
Huh.
Easter Parade. And she sang
Wow.
Easter Parade better than Judy Garland, which is saying something. And she sang the straight line, but what she played on the piano was just a fantasia of Easter
Mhm.
music. And it
Yeah.
was mind blowing. So that was number one, James Cleveland in Los
Ah.
Angeles.
Mhm.
Gloriously, expressively, emotionally.
Mhm.
And then the other, my one of my personal beloveds, her real name is Elberdita. Do you know who I'm talking about?
Mhm. Twinkie Clark.
Twinkie
Yes,
Clark. Wait, I had Twinkie Clark on this program a couple of years ago. I don't know if you saw it.
I did. Yep.
That was an absolute thrill. That Twinkie Clark, who sits at the organ and she plays what comes into her mind, and
Hmm.
she plays the whole world on the organ.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
the other Clark sisters are good singers and so on. They've not always gotten along, but Twinkie is the one who's just in her genius world,
Hmm.
and you just never know what's going to come. And it's
Yeah.
just astonishing that she can do that. And where it comes from, I don't know. But what I'm saying is that there are ways, if you're not following, say, a traditional Mozart piano concerto or a Handel oratorio, to work other things into the music being performed.
Hmm.
Do you do that?
No. And here's why. I wish I had the skill of a Twinkie Clark. I mean, if you listen to like 90% of gospel musicians, like especially organists, they are some of the most brilliant composers on the planet.
Yeah.
And I think I struggle so much like writing. I'm working on a song cycle now. Um, and I'm struggling because I don't have like the fluency that say someone like that. Like there's this guy who plays at Ephesus Seventh Day Adventist Church where I am. His name is Mike. Man, he can get on that organ and just, I mean, make up stuff on the spot. And I'm like, where did you get that from?
Mhm.
Th- that's not my mind. I'm not, wired that way. When I stand up in front of people, I even if I'm not saying it, my gestures, my body language are that of a singer. That's where I'm coming to it from. And I think it's affected me in some ways because I could probably be like Beethoven Jr. by now if I was wired a little bit differently.
um, then you do very well what's called musical arranging.
Hmm.
Not everybody knows what arranging is when it comes to music.
Hmm.
It's not redecorating.
Mm-mm.
What is arranging?
It's funny you say that, mention that, because I just had an experience and I was applying for, I'm going to go the long way around, so bear with me. I was applying
Here.
for a grant and it was for new compositions, new works, right? And my piece that I was submitting fit the bill completely. It was when I said that they were arrangements of traditional spirituals and that I used as the libretto the traditional spirituals text. That it was like little, red flags went off, and this lady says, "Oh, well, they're just arrangements." And I was taken aback. I couldn't. First of all, that she would say that to me, and I'm on the phone. I mean, it's like, "Hello, I'm here,"
Mhm.
and I had to explain to her that the work that I'm putting forth is not just me taking someone else's melody and putting the sort of the proverbial papa under it. There's a
Right.
lot of craftsmanship that goes into making an arrangement. And I can't say this for everyone, but if you listen to any of my arrangements, there are only maybe three where you can pick out the original melody for at least 90% of the song. I've
Mhm.
taken it and done what I want to do with it. And there's something I learned at Morehouse from Dr. Yuzi Brown. We were talking about musical compositions and arrangements of spirituals. And he said, and I'm paraphrasing, but to honor the music and the people who came up with it, always give some sort of historical reference that they know this is what the spiritual was. This is before you touched it or did anything with it, wherever it comes, present it at some point. And so I try to honor that in all of my music, but it's certainly more than just sort of taking somebody else's melody and putting a little accompaniment under it. I mean, you have to consider. I just wrote an arrangement of a piece. "Oh Rocks Don't Fall on Me." It's a old spiritual that's not done very often. As a matter of fact, I think the only arrangement I could really pinpoint is H.T. Burley's, and
Mhm.
I had to completely
Let's say
rewrite
who
it.
Harry Burley was, because he was an important figure that not everybody knows who Harry Burley was.
Yes, so
Who
H.T.
was Harry
Burley,
Burley?
Harry Thacker Burley,
Yep.
was a composer and arranger who lived in New York, and he attended church here in New York. He was also a protege of Antonin Dvorak. H.T. Burley sang quite a lot, and later on began to write and arrangements and compile books of spirituals. And still to this day, the most important anthologies and the most widely used anthologies of spirituals that we have are his. They're in 2 volumes, and they're both for low voice and high voice, so you can get them, in pretty much in whatever key you need. And he was very important to the spirituals genre in particular, but he also did art songs and the rest of it too.
And I'm just going to add about him that, yes, indeed, Dvorak adored Harry Burley. Mm-hmm. And around 1892, so in other words, 400 years about after Columbus allegedly discovered people who were here already, there was in Union Square in Lower Manhattan a celebration of Columbus Day. And Harry Burley and Antonin Dvorak went together to Union Square. And the impact that it had on Dvorak to hear music from Finns, from Germans, from Italians, from Jews, from Irish, from African Americans, from Latinos, people from all over the world making music in Union Square. When Dvorak taught nearby at the Music Academy on 17th Street, and Burley was one of his prize students, it was Harry Burley who, in effect, communicated to Dvorak that this is the new world. And so the name symphony, it's not symphony for or of, it's symphony from the new world. And Dvorak composed that as a message to people back in the Czech Republic and Bohemia in Central Europe, that the symphony from the new world this is what things sound like here. And the most famous music, the Largo, Going Home, was taught to Dvorak by Harry T. Burley, who we should say was black. I don't, it's you and I know that, but he was an African American at a time when, frankly, a European teaching and learning from an African American in 1892, even in New York, was not typical at all. And so their musical and personal friendship had huge impact on music in Europe as well as music in North America. And so when you mention that, Burley, Burleigh, by the way, not Burley like being heavy. So therefore, I got you a bit off the track there, but this idea of arrangement, meaning that the arranger, I'll say his, but of course it could be her, musical influences and ideas bring something new to the music. And if the arrangement is good, not all arrangements are good, we learn new things. We hear the same music in new ways. So a very famous arranger died not too long ago, Quincy Jones, who studied with Nadia Boulanger in Paris, had a great classical as well as popular training, and could hear music and transform it into something that was not derivative. It was original, it was new, it was refreshing and universal. And so I, for one, do not put down arrangements, but as you indicated, a lot of people who don't quite know what it is are dismissive of musical arrangements. Another thing I want to ask you about, I know you studied with Nico Castell. Nico Castell, unfortunately, is someone who's a bit forgotten, but I think it's important that we talk about him. When I worked at the Metropolitan Opera, I knew him. Talk about Nico Castell.
Wow. He was like a full-blown hurricane coming into the room. I mean, he was a lot of energy. I met Nico Castell when I was a student at Manus. So after I graduated from Eastman, I felt like I needed to do some more work, particularly
Could
on my
you
voice.
parenthetically, because you're mentioning important places, you have a very distinguished CV. And when you say when I graduated from Eastman, you went to Morehouse. What is Eastman? Pretty
Yes. So
remarkable. Renee Fleming studied there. A lot of people studied Eastman.
yeah, Eastman School of Music is a part of the University of Rochester, and it is one of the, I guess, most prominent schools of music in the United States. And I went there for my master's degree in conducting. And after I finished my conducting degree, I felt like I wanted to work on my voice some more because I mean I sang while I was there, but conducting was my concentration. And so I came to Manus, and in my first year at Manus College of Music here in New York, which is now a part of the New School.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but see, when I went to Manus, we were on West 85th Street.
Right.
Now they've moved down to West 14th to
13th, 14th. Yeah.
14th, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, to
Mm-hmm.
the village. Um, so Joseph Culinary was the head of the opera department at Manus, and Joseph Culinary was also on staff at the Met. And he would bring in all kinds of his colleagues and whatnot. Regina Resnick was our artist in residence, and he brought in Nico Castell to give us diction lessons. And I will never forget this experience. And I'm not just saying it because I happened to have sung well that day. This actually happened. So I learned the aria from William Tell, Resta Immobile.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd been working on it with my voice teacher, and I was in good shape. And Culinary comes and he says, "I want you to sing in the Castell masterclass." And we knew he was the diction god. So everybody was going to like the books that he put together, the IPA books. I can't think of it's a whole series of them. Any opera you want to look at, he's done the IPA for. And so everybody was looking at that, and I was like, you know what? I'm good. I'm not gonna stress out. I'm not gonna do that. And I didn't. I go to the class. I sing the aria. He looks at me, and he says, "Young man, it was almost perfect." I almost passed out. I couldn't believe it. There was one double M that shouldn't have been there, and he identified it. He says, "You don't have to sing it again. Go have a seat." I mean, I couldn't believe it. Especially because he torn, and this is not nice, but he did. He tore everyone else apart.
Yes.
And I mean, he was notorious for this. I'm not talking out of school. I mean, he was known for being difficult when it came to diction. But I'm not fluent in Italian, but my Italian is good enough that I can manage a good conversation, and I'm okay. And so I knew I would be in good shape. And I felt very confident. He was very kind to me. And I think we also got on because we both had done the Haushofmeister in Ariadne auf Naxos, which was a little bit that we talked about. I mean, after the class, but we talked about it a little bit. I did it at Brevard a year or two.
It's kind of a spoken role, right?
It's a spoken part, yeah.
Yeah.
So the what's his name? I went to Brevard Music Center. It's like one of the young artist programs here in the States. And he was just about to retire. David Efron was is a very well-known conductor, and he was about to retire. And Ariadne was, I want to say it was his last show, and he assigned me the lackey, and then changed it after we met at Eastman because Eastman had honored him in the year before. And we met, and I told him I was coming to Brevard and so forth. And he said, "Something about your personality. I don't want you to be offended by this, but I want you to do the Haushofmeister. There's some kind of command you have that I'd like you to change the part." So I said, fine. And
it's
so I did that.
Better than a lackey.
Never been. Never been. Yeah. Yep. And so I think Nico and I sort of hit it off a little bit after the class from having done that. There's a video, I think, of him doing the part.
Yeah.
I want to say there's a video. I think there's a video of it. Yeah.
I mentioned Nico Castell because he was very formidable
Mm-hmm.
and was for decades at the Met. He was a singer, but he was also the authority on pronunciation in all the operatic languages. What is IPA that you said in passing? What does that mean for people who don't know what IPA is? Because
Yes.
in brewing, that's a kind of beer, but I know
Yeah.
you don't know that.
Yeah. So it's the International Phonetic Alphabet, and it's how we break down words in language.
Yeah.
So you can, figure out how to pronounce certain vowel sounds and all the rest of it.
And so there's a way that these things are printed for
Mm-hmm.
pronunciation. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. I even
So,
have an IPA book over here on the side of my shelf here. So, for example, if you're, let's say we're dealing with French, there is a way that we write out the French nasal, the nasal sound, so we know what that feels like, that phoneme feels like, what it sounds like. And, it helps sort of guide how we will ultimately sing a particular piece of music. So if I'm singing, let's say, what's the danse en sommeil, the what's it, forêt. Then if I've done the IPA for it, I know what vowels are open, I know which vowels are closed, and they help line things up
what's
in
an
your.
open and a closed vowel?
So an open vowel, let's say if we're taking the vowels, there's a, e, o, u. A is the open form. There's no sort of covering, or there's nothing that obstructs the pronunciation of a. Then that can be narrowed so that there's, for example, in French, en, you get into a sort of a narrower position for that. And it happens for all of the other vowels as well. So for O, open O sound, and then that can be modified to a narrower vowel as well.
There was, I think she's died, a very famous singing teacher named Vera Rosa, Rosza.
Okay.
And she was Hungarian, but she was based primarily in England. And her two most famous students were Carey and Corita Matila, two
Oh,
magnificent singers.
yeah.
But what I always noticed with them, especially Carey, but really both of them, is that the letter E,
Mm-hmm.
as in amore or
Mm-hmm.
prego, was more amore, and not
Mm-hmm.
or amori, but it
Mm-hmm.
was not amore.
Mm-hmm.
And I asked Carita Martel about that once, and she said that's how I was trained. She said I'm aware. Italians have corrected me and said no, it's amore. But
Yeah. Yeah.
apparently, Vera Rocha believed that the way the mouth opened and the sound that came out when you're Carita Martel or Carita Cana was gorgeous, was more beautiful with that letter E than amore. It sort of
Yeah.
heightens amore was a
Uh-huh.
different sound. So even
Yeah.
though grammatically it's not correct, musically it was kind of beautiful.
Yeah.
So those are choices to make. Now, um, I know that among the many people you did master classes with as a student,
Mm-hmm.
there's one fellow who I met briefly. I shook his hand. It was an honor, but I never got to speak to him, was William Warfield.
Ah, yes. Mm-hmm.
Now, who was William Warfield? I know who he was, but you talk about William Warfield.
William Warfield, this is not to offend his name or anything, but most people will know him as Leontine Price's husband,
Yeah.
ex-husband. William Warfield was a baritone. He was a very prominent recitalist, and also went to the Eastman School of Music in Rochester. And I had the chance to sing a master class for him. I want to say was it 2000? I think it was something like that. Yeah. I was still
2001.
okay. All right, that's close. Yeah. I was still at Morehouse, and he was known particularly for having sung the role of Elijah. That was one of his most prominent roles in the
And
oratorio Elijah
Mendelssohn
by
Elijah.
Mendelssohn.
Yeah.
Yes, by Felix Mendelssohn. Mm-hmm. And every year, the National Association of Negro Musicians has a convention, and NAM, as it is called by acronym, is the oldest musical organization that focuses on and supports musicians of color, Black musicians in particular. And at this particular conference, William Warfield gave a master class, and my voice teacher told me, you don't go there with anything other than Elijah and work
Uh,
on with him, because you would be learning it from someone who really knows it inside and out. And it's so funny. It was a sort of a gang up on me session because I also, as the pianist to start, was Sylvia Olden Lee, who
uh,
is, I
yeah.
mean, she was a coach at the Met and one of, I want to say, was she the first black coach at the Met or
I don't know, but she was a very famous coach. I don't know if she was the
yeah.
first. Yeah.
And she also was at the Curtis Institute in Philadelphia, and she coached. I mean, her one of her most famous pupils is Kathleen Battle,
Right.
and
I'm going to
um,
interrupt and say that the famous Jesse Norman Kathy Battle gospel throwdown, that was
mhm,
Sylvia Olden Lee, who was the backbone of the whole event. Yeah.
mhm. And she's in the video playing for them.
Hmm.
What's "Scandalizing My Name"? I think you can see
Yep.
her playing in the back. The thing that was so special about her was that they say she could play, or they said she could play every score from memory. She proved it. I said to her, I'd like to sing Is Not His Word Like a Fire from Elijah. That was one of the things I was singing a lot in those days. And she says, Oh, honey, I don't need that. She goes to the piano and she sits down and she starts to play bum beep bum 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 bum. She couldn't play it as fast as she used to, when she was younger. By this point, I mean, I don't know how old she was. She was really quite old at this point. And so she asked Joseph Joubert to
Hmm.
play for her instead. And Joseph is one of the most brilliant, phenomenal pianists you'll ever come to know. He also does a lot of us talking about arranging. He does a lot of arrangements for Broadway musicals. So, for example, MJ, the musical that was just on Broadway, he's responsible for the
Michael
music for that.
Jackson. Yeah.
Yeah, The Wiz, Shrek the musical, you name it, he's done it. And so he played for me. And William Warfield, he for as he was not a tall guy, but he was tall enough.
Yeah.
Um, he was not imposing at all. He says, "Son, you've done well." We went over the text, and he asked me some things about interpretation, and I thought that was the end of the class. The class had not even started. After the class was over, I saw him in the lobby. Said, Come here. And we sat down and had a full on conversation about everything musical, about life, and about, what you do when you get into your profession, how you keep your voice in shape. And I mean, it was just, he was so generous. And that was the only time I'd ever met him and engaged with him. But when I got to Eastman, it was in my first year. He passed away, and I went to his funeral in Rochester, and I got to meet his nephew, who was a dancer and a very well-known dancer, as a matter of fact. And they played for, I don't know what you call it, but it's like right before the funeral starts. There's like, normally the musicians will play like something quiet on the piano as people are
Hmm.
walking in. They played recordings of William Warfield at his
Mm.
service. And of course, they played Elijah. And
Yeah.
they played It Is Enough. They played Schubert Lieder. I think it was like three of them, because he was also a very, well-known recitalist.
I mean, I certainly agree with you that he was known for Elijah, but I think that most people, if you were to ask them, because he was married to Leontine Price, he was not the original Porgy and she was not the original Bess. It was Todd Duncan. It was her name, Ann Evans. What was Ann's last name? And the original Bess. We'll think
Oh.
of it, but it was Todd Duncan and Ann, whatever her name was. But there was a famous 1952 State Department tour in which Leontine Price and William Warfield went, I believe, to the Soviet Union, but they went to all kinds of places singing Porgy and Bess in concert form. And there's a recording of that from 1952. And
And Wiggins Brown.
and Williams Brown. This
Mhm.
and so I mean, frankly, I knew him from that more than Elijah.
Mhm.
Somehow I knew people like Thomas Allen and Bryn Tervel for Elijah, and I
Mhm.
knew the recording, but I didn't. I didn't think of him as being so deeply identified with the role, but he was, of course.
Hmm.
Which leads us to Leontine Price. Not too long ago, her brother died, General George Price, whom I
Hmm.
knew. I think you knew him as well. I'd like to have us pay tribute to him. He was a remarkable man. He served his country in at least two ways. Number one, he had a very long and brilliant military career, 27 years, but he also served, and he did it beautifully, but he also served the country by taking exquisite care of his sister.
Hmm.
And I always felt that she had her managers who I knew and her assistants, and there was a crowd around Miss Price, but it was always General Price, especially after about 1995, who
Hmm.
made sure that she was comfortable, that she, of course she could sing, but when you are Leontine Price, when you are such a symbol for millions and millions of people, either from a African American point of view, from a musical paragon, you name it, she is, because she's still with us, thank God, a symbol, but someone needed to take care of her,
Hmm.
so to
Hmm.
speak. Um, and he did that so beautifully. I know that you knew him, you met him. Would you talk about General George Price?
Yes, I met him. It's weird because I shouldn't say it's weird, but this was in what was it? I want to say 20. When did Shirley Verrett pass away? 2010, was it? I
Too
think.
soon is all I can say about that.
Yeah.
He and I
Shirley
were
Verrett
close.
had passed
Yeah,
away,
yeah.
and I can say this. I am the associate choir director at Ephesus Seventh Day Adventist Church in Harlem, and Hall Johnson, the another great composer and arranger of spirituals, lived in a building not far from Ephesus, a couple of blocks east of Ephesus. And during her Juilliard days, Shirley Verrett worked with Hall Johnson.
Mm-hmm.
And as we understand it, attended Ephesus for a short period of time because she was Seventh Day Adventist.
Mm-hmm.
And so when she passed away, my friend Kevin Miller, Kevin is a coach now. He's in pianist. He's all over the place. Um, Decided to do a memoriam for Miss Verrett. I'd met her, I had met her on more than one occasion, so I felt I could do this. Um, I wanted her colleagues to speak about her, and I knew that I couldn't get Leontine Price there. So Columbia Artist Management was still open at the time, and she was still on the roster, even though long been retired by this point. But she was still on the roster. So I wrote Cami, Columbia Artists, a letter, and I said, "We're doing this tribute, and I'd like to get something from Leontine Price." They sent the letter to General Price, and my all of my information was on the letter that I sent. He didn't just write, some generic letter. He called me. And he was, his voice was really, booming. He was like, "Young man, what can I do for you?" And I was like, "Oh my God," like, whoa, whoa. And we hit it off. We talked on the phone for like 3 hours. I'm not exaggerating the time frame.
Yep.
We talked a long time. And he was so generous and kind. And he ultimately sent the letter from Miss Price, and we included it in the tribute to Miss Verrett. Then during the pandemic, I started a magazine called The Whole Review, and I sent to him a copy of the magazine because I wanted to include a sort of a tribute to, or not to commemorate is the word I'm looking for, Leontine Price's 60th anniversary of her Met debut happened to be that same year. So it must have been
January
2020.
1961.
Yes, it was 21. Yeah. And so I wrote, not I wrote, I sent him a packet of the magazines so he could see the quality of it, because I knew he was that kind of guy. You have to show him what you're talking about. He didn't write me back. He got on the phone, called me, and again he was like, "Young man, how you doing?" And I was like, "Okay, who is this?" And we, reconnected, and we talked. Again, hours and hours. And we didn't just talk about, the magazine. We talked about everything, uh, life, and just, how he got to be so old. Um, we talked about his military service and the fact that, it was a great honor for him. And I think I should underscore that, because even at his age, and with so much history behind him, he never looked at his service as service. He
Mhm.
always talked about it as joy. Like it was just like we get up and go, grab some water out of the refrigerator. It was something you're supposed to do. And he felt so proud about it, and we talked a lot about that. He was what we call in Memphis a stand-up guy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Both he and Leontine, I can call her Leontine because that's what I've called her. I worked with her. I had the honor of working with her. Um, were highly patriotic. And it's a word that in our times, but in all times in the United States, can cut many ways, because sometimes it's used as a cudgel and a cleaver to marginalize people who are not patriotic the way you are expected to be. They grew up in Laurel, Mississippi, completely segregated, horrible racism in Mississippi. I mean, Nina Simone, who was from North Carolina, when she had to describe racism in music, it was called Mississippi Goddamn, because it was the whole, even Alabama beat Mississippi with that. And Alabama was no great shakes, it was Tuskegee and all that. But yet they grew up in Laurel, and they had such a profound sense of love for this country. And when 9/11, when September 11th, 2001 happened here in New York, I knew Leontine. I knew that she was very moved by the incident and by what happened. And she was in retirement. 2001, she would have been 74, I think. And February 10th is her birthday. And she decided to come out of retirement and sing at Carnegie Hall at a concert. It was September 30th of 2001. I was there with my cousin Alice, who was an actress who sang at the Met. And we had Marilyn Horne and Yo-Yo Ma and James Levine and wonderful musicians. And then Leontine appeared. And she sang He's Got the Whole World in His Hand and Oh, America the Beautiful. A cappella.
God bless America.
God bless America. You're right. God bless America. And no, that was Ray Charles. Another patriot, really, seriously, who, despite everything, was incredibly patriotic for this country, which is great and when it's done right. And that was her sense of service. And both General George Price and Leontine Price have a sense of service to their country. And I find it so remarkable because even though they had incredible gifts, the two of them, not just Leontine, they were dealt a very difficult hand that they had to overcome. Put it mildly, put it bluntly. And the fact that they still had these reserves of love and affection for their country always stunned me. That he had, I knew her better, but he had and she has the most remarkable memory that I've ever come across. Where I would be with her and she would meet someone and say, "So, young man, I remember you." And he was from Daytona Beach, Florida. She said, "You're from Florida," which is the way she pronounced it. "You're from Florida." "Yes, ma'am." "Was it Daytona Beach?" "Yes." "And that was Bethune College, am I right?" "Yes, ma'am." "And you like science." Forgive me for imitating Leontine Price, but I can kind of do it a bit. "You like science." "Yes, ma'am." "So what have you done with it?" "Well, ma'am, I'm in medical school." "Well, I'm honored to meet you." And the verb that she uses, and I'm getting goosebumps as I think about it, she would hand back the recognition. And she would always say, "It's an honor to meet you," or "I'm honored to hear that." The only thing was in the era before camera phones, people would show up with cameras, and I would often be with her on her right and General Price on her left, and she would always break out of the sort of, welcoming, warming person that she was, and she'd move her hand like this, and she would say, "En distance, s'il vous plaît." En
Give me a little space.
30 feet away to take the photograph. En distance, s'il vous plaît. So I love talking to you. You know that. And I'm going to conclude our conversation today, which is just the latest conversation, by bringing something up that you know that I care about a lot. You have something in common with the great South African soprano Elze van den Haver, who is now singing Die Frau nach Schatten of the Met is doing Zalem at the Met. Do you know what that is?
No.
You were the two finest bakers in opera. So much so,
I had no idea where you were going.
A baritone or a conductor or an arranger or a teacher. Had you just applied yourself to baking, you would have done fine anyway. And Elze van den Haver the same. She's a remarkable baker. And so talk about your baking.
I don't even know how to respond. That really got me. That was a good one. Listen, I got baking from my grandma. My grandmother was a cook. I mean, she was a cook. She did it for a living while she worked. And there's a picture of her that we all have of her standing with the cake in her hand like this, and it's so beautifully decorated. I mean, it's just like, my grandma was like, she was legit. You know what I'm saying? And so I got my baking skills, I guess, from my grandmother. And I will say I feel that I'm a better cook than I am baker. That's my personal opinion. But I tested it out. I think if this is where we're going, I tested it out on a television show called The Great American Baking Show. And you know how they say the cookie crumbles? Well, my cookies crumbled.
At least you have cookies.
Man, we had to make a gingerbread house, and that bad boy, it just wouldn't do it. But I still bake. As a matter of fact, I just baked a wedding cake for a college friend of mine, and I hadn't done that in 6 years. I put it down. I mean, I make something small for myself, but like nothing big. And I tell you, I almost had a panic attack the day of the wedding because it was basically a 5-tier cake, and just transporting that bad boy was like nerve-wracking.
Mm-hmm.
It was beautiful. Everybody loved it. And I don't have to do that again. So that's enough about baking.
No, I want to bring up something else.
No questions about butterscotch.
Well, I'm not bringing butterscotch, but just a couple more things. And number one is, there is in the cooking world, and some listeners know I've written 10 books on food, so I'm a pro. But there is a belief that these abilities skip a generation. And that if the grandmother or the grandfather is a good cook, the grandchild will be a good cook or baker, but not the in-between. And that's not necessarily whether there's a parent around, but somehow, I don't know why that is, but it certainly was in my case. My mother, Kay cook. My aunt's a not very good cook. I'm a good cook. My grandmother, who I scarcely knew, she died when I was a toddler, so I didn't learn cooking from her, but somehow it got passed on. You probably stood at her elbow and watched and learned. And did she communicate to you, this is what I'm doing, this is what I'm thinking? Because what I'm talking about here is like musical knowledge, that these things are transmitted sometimes verbally and sometimes just visually. So I'm wondering where you picked up the knowledge.
That's so cool. I can. I mean, it was a lot of it was visual until I got older. When I got to college and I would come home, I'll never forget this one time. It was Thanksgiving. I wanted to make the turkey and the dressing. Okay. And so I would go back and forth from the kitchen to the living room because my grandmother would always sit in the living room in her recliner. And I'd go back and forth and ask her, okay, am I doing this right? Do I, did I put too much celery or whatever? And there was one point where she said, look, you just got to do it yourself. And I was like, oh, okay, that's how we're doing. Okay. But it was so important because I had to come up with the palette. I had to come up with, how much of this do we need to put in it that's gonna, soothe, be nice for the palate. She didn't want to give me all the answers. The only thing that I would say that I wish to this day that I'd learned from her is there was some way she did potatoes gratin that I just don't know how she did it, and I never asked how do you get it like this, but I mean, she was like a whiz in the kitchen. But I literally right at her elbow, and I can remember what the pots look like, the pans.
Yep.
I can tell you there's a meme going around now that it's Thanksgiving time on Facebook, and it's this set of pot cookware that has like the flowers on the side, and everybody had those. We had those, so I can remember all of that stuff. And I would just watch her, and she would just do her thing. But there was only one time where she would like sort of give me instruction, and then she said, "You need to go on your own way." Okay, so you'll probably get a little bit, not a little bit
around the world. I'm just going to add that some internet glitch here in New York disconnected me from Courtney, so I'm just going to pick up where I was. And we're about to conclude our conversation anyway. But what I want to say to Courtney is that it's generally accepted that people who are very good cooks and chefs are not good bakers, because and vice versa, because the bakers are the scientists, they're the mathematicians. They are what the Italian great food writer Artusi referred to as the scientist in the kitchen, whereas the chefs are the artists in the kitchen. And it's not that one is better than the other. But if you don't use your temperatures and measurements perfectly in baking, it could all come crumbling down. Whereas if I add not enough of something in my pasta dish, I can correct it if I know what I'm doing. And I'm bringing that back to music, in that there is an art of making music and there's a science of making music. And part of what I love about you and your work is that you are both an artist and a scientist when it comes to making music. And not everyone is. So, and even if your cookie crumbles, the fixing.
They crumbled.
So, Courtney, Carey, I mean, I was about to conclude when our internet went down. Did I leave anything out that you wanted to cover?
No, you have been absolutely wonderful. This has been really cool. Just catching up. Yeah.
Then I thank you very much. Keep up the good work, and people out there in the world, look for the latest Courtney Carey creation, whether it's butterscotch or an arrangement or a symphony or the next great vocal work. I love your work, and I love you. Thank you, Courtney.
I love you. Thank you so much, Fred.
Take care.
All righty.